Hey Brobots, and welcome to what I feel is my best effort yet on reaching my ultimate goal of showing you exactly how I produce the finish on my models. Coming up on 2 years of making videos has given me the confidence to go deeper into the techniques and strategies I use, so if I may be so bold, I'd like to call today's video my first attempt at a masterclass level of depth on chipping for a Maschinen Krieger model, in this case the MK44 AMMOknight. Today I'd like to share with you one chapter of my premium content for free, and you can view the remaining chapters on my Patreon if you're interested. I've included a link below. Okay, let's go. Now for sponging today, I'm going to do a two-step process. I'm going to use a little bit of this and a little bit of that. First round, because this is a largish model, I'm going to go with a cellulose sponge, and you can get these in the makeup section from a pharmacy. Here in close-up, you can see that the cellulose sponge is much coarser. It has a much rougher texture than the standard sponge that most people will probably use on the Wright. And I'll be using that in a second stage later. Snip off a slice, and we're good to go. Continuing on from our work yesterday, I've made a mix here. I've got matte black up here at the top, I've got chipping color here below, and then a mix of 50-50 here on the wet palette. Using the 50-50 mix, wiping some of the excess off on a paper towel, let's start working it in and blending it into some of these patches that we have on the model like this. I've got a couple of extra notes here to add over the top as Link Primary goes into deep contemplation mode on his chips there. I specifically cut this sponge into this shape with the plan in mind of using that frontal aspect of it to develop the longitudinal axis chips that look like large dragging scratches, as if the suit had moved through an abrasive environment, and to help give the suit the idea of movement, giving it some horizontal forward speed, because it's a very static posed model and there's nothing you can do about it. It's articulated, I mean it moves, but basically you could imagine you can only put it in the standing pose. So that was a really important thing here. Now I'm also using the pre-existing chips and layering around them, going over the top sometimes, but also adding extra ones to it. Quite a few things happening here, but most important thing I wanted to point you at was that I used the primary frontal part of this sponge. We could have used other aspects of it, but we can probably do that in a different shaped model in the future that has a different theme for us. Now straight chipping color. A slightly heavier mix over the top. Really work these edges. Translation. I've used the Ammo by MiG chipping color here in a relatively straight fashion. It's not diluted, and I've used it as a heavier overcoat to layer over some of the sponges in an attempt to give them an apparently older aspect due to having oxidized. Here is probably the best example I captured of showing how the cellulose sponge produces a different scratch, both in terms of size and texture. By using the inside of the piece rather than an edge and pushing it into the piece we're weathering, you can see that it's developed fine and slightly jagged scratches rather than the usual dots that we achieve with the fine sponge. Most interesting, and perfect for a larger, heavily weathered model like the MK44. Here, using the flat surface of the larger sponge is also producing a fine and interesting effect. I quite liked it. As the paint dried, you can see that we could do finer and finer chips here towards the end. That's really nifty to know. Okay, here we go, the Moneyshot Chips. Here are the chips that sell this finish, the Moneyshot Chips. These chips and the streaks and effects that originate from them help define the finish and provide focal points for us to believe that it could be real. Using the sponge's pointy end, let's use it to produce the foundation for a running chip and scratch, and control the placement with pinpoint precision. Double tap for extra emphasis and go in reasonably wet with this stage. Oh, look at this one. There we go. Boom. Money shot. Oh yeah, that's good. Another one right in place. There we go. A good longitudinal one, so he scratched it as he was walking along. Brilliant. It's quite wet too. You can see I've added quite a bit of the larger scale chips to the model. There's the next step, and that was all done with the large scale spongering. Now for one more round, I'm going to scale it down and go with small scale spongering. I've pinched off a small piece of sponge here to use. On a larger model, this will be a final spongering step, but on a smaller model, you could go with these first. Using the same paint mixes from before, might freshen it up a little bit. Some chipping color, some matte black. Go with the darker ones first. And then wiping some excess off on paper. Let's carefully work around the edges. Getting a feel for both how much paint is on the sponge, but also to keep it nice and randomized. Small freshies. After marking out our major Moneyshot chips, think of this step as a way to flesh out the details, provide backup and fine detail. You can see that I've gone with a slightly darker mix here to give the idea of fresher chips and provide more contrast due to the reduction in scale. This is not a big deal, but it's these small improvements and details to your finish that our eyes and brains read as interesting and provide another layer of realism. Working the paint on the sponge from fresh will give us a slightly larger, rounder chip, and over the few minutes carrying out this work, the paint will dry, giving us a natural progress down to the fine scratches and dots. Again, I try to work with the properties of the paint rather than against it for a more productive workflow. As my darker mix ran out and dried on the sponge, I reloaded the sponge, the same one. I kept going with it. I was very happy with the shape and pattern with straight Ammo by MIG chipping. It's a lighter color, and I think it's a very good one to represent things like oxidization, oxidized metal. It's quite a red brown color, and I'm layering those over the top of the darker chips in an attempt to give them an apparent age difference. The red chips will tend to look older because it's given them time to oxidize, and it looks more interesting to go from a darker foundation and then work up through the color gradient and start to produce lighter color chips. Now, working around, showing you the entirety of the model here, you can see I'm working around different areas and examining it very closely. This is part of the process. I do know that I see some people that will work the parts entirely by themselves. I've done that more for demonstration purposes. Here is my usual workflow that I like to look at the model as a whole. I emphasize that a lot during my tutorials. We display the models finished, so I like to work on them finished so I can have an idea of its overall impact. I want the model to look cool overall rather than just in select places. So looking at balance, overall integrity of the chips, and giving it a better read overall. And I think this is just a very self-educational step to go through to make sure that you're keeping the model cohesive and not giving it the same finish overall everywhere. That's the best way to ruin something. Our eyes will instantly see that if you've got a similar finish over everything, our eyes and our brain become bored, and it's a death knell for a weathered finish. Let's take our time now to augment and upgrade some of the foundation chips that we've provided before. The sponge I'm working with now, it's quite wet, so you can see it's giving me that good, it's a slightly round sort of chip, so I know I can do that. Layer that over some of these, the ones that I was calling the longitudinal type scratches there, to increase their volume. You can stretch out chips and you can make them wider, or you can just add volume there. So there I know I'm going to make a detail point at the rear of the model. Here I really liked it. I stretched out this money chip on top to make it into a real focal point. This has really become one of my favorite places on the model. Thanks for watching that through with me. Please consider subscribing and ring the bell to get notifications for future content. If you really like the video, please keep in mind that there's both more of this one and a growing library of past content that you can access all of with your Patreon membership. and this helps me to make deeper and more detailed content for you. Not sure yet? Check out our Facebook group, Friendly Tips and Advice. Big thanks to Hobbyco and Little Robot. I do my best to buy from and support local to keep our money in our communities and to empower events. Huge shout out to the Rocket Punch Brobot team. Ivan, MB, Grant, Con, Jack, RJ, Simon, Robert, Kelso, Kevin, David, Derek, Alan and Nilos. This episode was supported by our patrons. Your support empowers me and makes all this happen. Thanks guys.